The rain had not ceased all night. A fine grey drizzle that clung to the cobblestones of Bloomsbury and blurred the lamps along the narrow street. It was the kind of weather that discouraged footsteps and muffled the city's usual clamour. So that when Constable Jarvis knocked on the tall green door of number 17, the sound carried sharply against the silence. The housekeeper, a gaunt woman with anxious eyes, admitted him at once, pressing a trembling finger to her lips before leading him to the study upstairs. The scene, as Jarvis later reported, had the quality of a stage carefully arranged for a single dramatic gesture. Mrs. Eleanor Harwood, widow of a shipping magnate long deceased, was slumped at the desk, her hand curled stiffly about the stub of a fountain pen. Before her lay a sheet of heavy paper, the sort she always used for correspondence, upon which a few words had been scrawled in a hurried, almost frantic hand. They read, "He comes tonight, and I cannot." The sentence ended abruptly in a blot of ink, as if the pen had been wrenched away. What made the matter peculiar was that the ink was still wet when Jarvis entered, yet Mrs. Harwood was already cold to the touch. Her eyes fixed in a glassy stare toward the French window at the far end of the room. The French window itself was locked from within, the bolts fastened securely top and bottom, and the key still in place on the inside of the door. The chimney grate was empty of fire. No ashes stirred within it, and the single door leading into the study had been closed when the housekeeper found her mistress. No intruder could have entered unseen, and no weapon lay at hand. The doctor, summoned promptly, announced that death was due to poison, most likely ingested in liquid form, though the half-full teacup on the desk contained nothing more sinister than weak Darjeeling. The doctor's verdict was couched in the uncertain tone of a man faced with a circumstance that refused to yield to logic. Inspector Parker, called to the scene, paced the length of the study with furrowed brow. The locked window, the closed door, the untouched teacup, every detail pressed the crime into that maddening category of the impossible. Suicide was suggested, but quickly dismissed. No vial, no tell-tale scent or residue betrayed how the widow might have administered such a dose herself. Moreover, the unfinished letter spoke of anticipation and dread, not resignation. She had been about to confide something. Someone was coming that night. Someone she feared. The housekeeper once questioned proved of little use. She had served Mrs. Harwood faithfully for 10 years, but swore she knew nothing of enemies or threats. The widow, though elderly, had been in good spirits of late, keeping regular correspondence with distant relatives and attending her charitable committees with diligence. Yet Parker could not ignore the subtle tremor in the housekeeper's manner when she described her mistress's final weeks. Mrs. Harwood, it seemed, had taken to writing letters at odd hours, burning many of them in the fireplace before dawn. The housekeeper had found ashes, scraps of half-scorched envelopes, but had not dared pry further. Neighbors, interviewed the next morning, added another fragment to the puzzle. One claimed to have seen a shadow at the study window late the previous evening, too tall for the widow herself, who was small and stooped. Another swore he heard the tread of boots retreating swiftly down the street sometime after midnight. Yet the wet pavements outside bore no prints when examined, the rain having washed all trace away. What set the case apart? What rendered it, in Inspector Parker's words, damnable and unsolvable, was the singular clue left upon the desk. That unfinished letter, "He comes tonight, and I cannot," seemed at once revealing and deliberately obscure. Who was the he? A blackmailer? An estranged relative? A spectre of the widow's imagination? The handwriting, so frantic in its stroke, belonged unquestionably to Mrs. Harwood herself. But the abrupt break, The ink blot suggested interruption, perhaps even violence, though how such could occur in a room locked against intrusion baffled every theory. By the second day, speculation ran rife in the papers. Mysterious widow's death in locked study filled the columns with lurid conjecture. Was it a message from beyond the grave? A vendetta stretching back to her husband's shadowy shipping ventures in the Orient? Or a family feud culminating at last in poison? The more the public speculated, the less certain the police became, for every avenue of inquiry led into fog. No financial irregularities marred her accounts. No relatives stood to inherit anything more than the modest estate she possessed. No trace of foreign correspondence or secret assignations turned up among her effects. Still, one fact refused to rest quietly, the pen clutched in her hand. Not merely any pen, but an antique chased silver model, heavy, old-fashioned, one Parker swore he had seen her use before with meticulous neatness. Why, then, would her final words appear so rushed, so clumsy, almost as if written by a trembling or unwilling hand? Parker, worn by hours of fruitless questioning, admitted at last that the affair lay beyond the ordinary scope of police procedure. The crime had the shape of deliberate misdirection. Too clean, too impossible, too neat in its theatrics. A locked room, a widow, an unfinished letter. One could almost hear the sinister hand of irony guiding each detail. And so, as often happened when an insoluble riddle pressed upon Scotland Yard, the inspector resolved to place a telephone call to a man in Piccadilly whose name had become synonymous with puzzles that defied ordinary reason. That call would summon the presence of Lord Peter Wimsey, amateur of crime and connoisseur of paradox, into the quiet house in Bloomsbury where the widow had penned her last unfinished line. The letter still lay upon the desk, its ink stain spreading like a darkened tear across the page, waiting for the one mind capable of tracing its meaning through the fog of impossibility. For the crime, insoluble though it appeared, was no mere accident of chance, but the first move in a game of intellect played against a foe both cunning and invisible. One who had left behind a clue as damning as it was deceptive. And until that clue was unraveled, the widow's last words would hang unanswered. A whisper from beyond the grave. Lord Peter Wimsey arrived the following afternoon in his usual unhurried manner, his monocle glinting faintly against the pallid light that streamed through the drawing-room windows of number 17. He looked almost absurdly out of place amid the solemn hush of the house, his tweed suit too cheery, his voice too flippant. And yet Inspector Parker felt an instant easing of the weight that had pressed upon him since the discovery. If any man could unpick the knots of this baffling affair, it was Wimsey. "I gather, old man," Wimsey remarked as Parker led him upstairs, "that we've got ourselves a first-class specimen of the locked-room variety. Always a pleasure, like chess against an unseen opponent. Shall we have a peep?" The study was precisely as it had been left, desk tidy save for the accusing letter. Curtains drawn against the drizzle. French window securely bolted. Wimsey paused at the threshold, his eyes flicking not to the body, removed the night before, but to the arrangement of objects left behind. He approached the desk without touching, leaning close to the unfinished letter. "Curious," he murmured. "Our widow, I take it, was not given to untidy scrawl." "On the contrary," Parker replied. "Her hand was steady, neat, almost fastidious. Yet here," Wimsey tapped the air above the paper, "she writes as though seized by tremor or by reluctance. See the angle of the pen's stroke. It trails downward, not upward, as though drawn by weight rather than directed by will. And this blot, too large for an accidental slip, more like the pen was snatched away or dropped. We must ask whether she finished the words herself, or whether another hand interfered. He lifted the fountain pen delicately in a gloved hand, examining its nib. A faint odor clung to it, not of ink alone but something acrid, sharp. Whimsy raised an eyebrow. "Has anyone tested this for residue?" The doctor sniffed about but found nothing conclusive. Parker admitted. "Poison, yes. But the means? Not yet established. Ink, perhaps, more versatile than we credit." Whimsy set the pen back in place, then crossed to the French window. He knelt, inspecting the bolts, the sill, the faint smear of condensation upon the glass. He produced a small magnifying lens, studying the minute scratches near the keyhole. Locked from within, certainly. But note, no dust upon the inside ledge, yet the rain left droplets outside. Someone opened this very recently, dried it, then locked it again. Our phantom came in and went out the same way. Parker frowned. But the housekeeper swears the bolts were fastened when she entered. They were? After someone took the trouble to replace them. Which suggests knowledge of this house, or patience enough to fumble in the dark. Whimsy straightened, brushing off his knees, and turned his gaze upon the grate. Empty, yes, but not unused. He sifted the ash with a careful finger. Burnt paper, no surprise there. But see, edges of blue ink, not the widow's black. She destroyed something recent, perhaps even another letter. "Tell me, Parker, did our good woman often burn her correspondence?" "Housekeeper says she did," Parker replied. "Odd hours, strange letters, always destroyed. Then we must ask, why keep this last one upon the desk? Why leave it unfinished, conspicuous? Unless she meant it to be found, or unless the intruder wished it so." The sound of soft steps interrupted them. The housekeeper, summoned by Parker earlier, appeared at the door, wringing her hands. Whimsy turned the full beam of his easy charm upon her. "Mrs. Briggs, is it not? Forgive my intrusion into your orderly household. I only wish to ask, did you, on the night in question, hear anything unusual? A scrape, a cry, a movement?" She shook her head. "Only the scratching of her pen, sir. I thought she was writing as usual. When the noise stopped, I went in and found her." Her voice trembled. Whimsy studied her narrowly. "And you touched nothing? Not even to loosen her hand from the pen?" "No, sir. I ran for help." "Quite proper." His eyes lingered a fraction too long on her clasped fingers, which twitched at the mention of the pen. He stored the detail away. When she had withdrawn, Parker whispered, "You suspect her." "I suspect everyone, old friend. That is the only way to keep from looking a fool later. But observe, she shuddered not at the body, but at the pen. Why should the instrument of writing unsettle her so?" The room grew still again, rain tapping faintly at the window panes. Whimsy moved with restless curiosity, testing the handle of the study door, tracing the line of the carpet where it met the threshold. He crouched suddenly, plucking something from the pile, a small scrap of coarse fiber, pale gray. He held it aloft. A thread, perhaps from a glove or a coat. Not the widow's, too rough for her attire. Let us see what other breadcrumbs our visitor has scattered. They found no more in the study. But as they descended the staircase, Whimsy's sharp eye caught another inconsistency. The umbrella stand in the hall contained not 2 umbrellas, as the housekeeper had sworn, but 3. One was plain black, its ferrule still damp though the others had dried. Somebody came in during the storm, Whimsy observed lightly. And unless Mrs. Harwood had a penchant for conjuring umbrellas from thin air. This belongs to our visitor. He examined the handle, noting a faint nick as though from a ring or buckle. Back in the drawing room, Whimsy leaned against the mantelpiece, his gaze distant yet intent. "Consider, Parker, we have an intruder admitted. Perhaps by the widow herself. for no locks are broken. He enters with wet umbrella, dries himself sufficiently, leaves behind a fibre and a chill upon the room. The widow begins a letter, perhaps under duress. Something about her comes tonight, then. Death by poison, yet no cup, no vial, no phial. What remains constant in every version of this tale? The pen, Parker answered slowly. Precisely. The pen she held, the pen she always used. The pen that may have been tampered with. An object too familiar to arouse her suspicion, yet intimate enough to deliver death unnoticed. Clever, diabolically so. But cleverness often trips itself, and I fancy our culprit has already blundered. What blunder? That, my dear Parker, remains to be proved. But we may begin by tracing this umbrella, and by asking ourselves why the housekeeper quails at the mention of so ordinary an object as a pen. One false note betrays an entire symphony, if only one listens closely. Outside, the rain slackened at last, leaving the air heavy with silence. Within number 17, however, silence was anything but empty. It throbbed with secrets, each waiting to be coaxed into the open beneath Lord Peter Wimsey's watchful eye. For the first signs of deception had surfaced, faint but undeniable. And the pattern of the widow's last hour was beginning, ever so faintly, to take shape. The umbrella, once placed upon the table in Parker's office, became a silent witness of its own. Wimsey regarded it as though it might confess, if only stared at long enough. The polished handle bore the faint impression of fingers, and that curious nick remained. A tiny scar upon the wood. Parker, meanwhile, busied himself with the task of arranging interviews. Neighbors, servants, distant relations, all must be heard. For in a house where death had come under impossible circumstances, no voice could be dismissed without scrutiny. The first to arrive was Mrs. Briggs, recalled for more formal questioning. She perched upon the edge of her chair, twisting her handkerchief, her gaze darting nervously to Wimsey's monocle whenever it caught the light. Now, Mrs. Briggs, Wimsey began gently. You were most precise about the sequence of events. The writing, the silence, your discovery of the body. But tell me, when you entered the study, was the lamp burning brightly or low? She hesitated. Low, sir. She'd not turned it up full. I thought it queer at the time, for her eyesight's been poor of late. Still, I didn't think, she faltered. Indeed. And did you notice the umbrella in the hall before you called for the constable? Her face tightened. No, sir. Only her too, as always. If there was another, it wasn't there then. Curious, Wimsey murmured. Then it appeared after the constable came, or you failed to observe it. Both unlikely, but not impossible, Parker interjected. The umbrella was there when I arrived, Briggs. You're certain you didn't overlook it? Her eyes flashed suddenly, defensive. I'd not overlook such a thing. The mistress was dead. Do you think I'd be counting umbrellas at such a time? Just so, Wimsey soothed, though he exchanged a glance with Parker that spoke volumes. When Mrs. Briggs was dismissed, Wimsey remarked quietly, Note the vehemence, Parker. She would deny the color of the sky if pressed too hard. People who tell the truth rarely protest so much. Next came Mr. Henry Vane, a distant cousin and one of the few relatives with any claim upon the widow's modest estate. He was a tall, gaunt fellow, his manner stiff as if he feared contamination from association with scandal. I assure you, Lord Wimsey, he declared, my visits were infrequent. My cousin and I maintained cordial relations, no more. She was an eccentric woman, writing letters at all hours, burning them, muttering about shadows in the street. I'm not surprised she came to a bad end. You knew of her habits then? Wimsey asked lightly. The midnight scribblings, the fires. She mentioned them once or twice. said she had ghosts to lay. Whatever nonsense that meant. I paid it little heed. And on the night of her death, you were where? At my club, dining with a friend. You may inquire. I've nothing to hide. His voice rang with the confidence of one rehearsed, yet Whimsy noted how his fingers drummed upon the arm of the chair, restless, betraying an agitation at odds with his composure. Your cousin wrote, "He comes tonight, and I cannot." Any idea whom she meant? Known. Some figment, no doubt. She was fanciful, prone to exaggeration. Whimsy smiled faintly. Exaggeration does not usually kill with poison, Mr. Vane. Thank you for your candor. When Vane had departed, Parker muttered, "Too smooth, that one. A rehearsed alibi, a convenient disdain. But no proof. No motive worth the name." "Perhaps," Whimsy replied, but note how readily he disparaged her. The dead cannot answer, so he paints her as fanciful. That in itself is a strategy. The following interview brought Mrs. Lydia Clare, a neighbor who had spoken of seeing a shadow at the study window. She entered with the eager air of one who enjoys an audience. "Oh, it was dreadful, Inspector," she said, settling herself comfortably. "I was passing in the street, quite by chance, when I glanced up and saw a figure. Tall, quite unmistakably a man. He moved across the window, I swear it. Poor Mrs. Harwood must have let him in. But the police would not listen properly at first." "Tall, you say?" Whimsy prompted. "Yes, sir, not stooped like the widow. Broad across the shoulders, too. I pride myself on a sharp eye. And the time? Just after 11, near enough. I was coming from a friend's house." Parker leaned forward. "You're sure of the time?" "Perfectly sure." She smiled complacently. Whimsy regarded her thoughtfully. Curious, Mrs. Clare. For another neighbor insists he heard boots departing close to midnight. Which would you have us believe? Her composure faltered for the first time. "Well, I may be mistaken by a few minutes, but certainly not the figure. He was there. Perhaps the other gentleman is mistaken." "Perhaps," Whimsy said. "Or perhaps both of you observed different moments. One entering, one leaving." Mrs. Clare brightened at this compromise, eager again to be useful. But when she had gone, Whimsy said softly, "Too eager by half. She relishes her role, but one detail troubles me. She claims to have seen the figure against the light, yet the housekeeper swears the lamp was low. A dim room does not silhouette broad shoulders at 20 paces. Either she embroideries, or she lies. The last to be seen that evening was young Thomas Briggs, the housekeeper's nephew, who often ran errands for the widow. He appeared ill at ease, his cap twisting in his hands. "I didn't see nothin', sir," he blurted before a question was asked. "Only the missus sent me that day to post a letter she did." Whimsy's monocle fixed him. "A letter? How thoughtful of you to recall. To whom was it addressed?" He flushed. I don't rightly know. Foreign name, maybe. Hard to say." "She was in a hurry. And you posted it where?" "At the pillar box near the square." "Excellent. Parker, we must have that letter traced. If possible. Young man, did your aunt mention the contents?" Thomas shook his head. "Only said it was important." His voice trembled, and Whimsy leaned closer, lowering his tone. "You're frightened, lad, not of us, of something else. Out with it." The boy's eyes darted, then lowered. "There was a gentleman hanging about the house, sir." "Not that night, but before. Asked me questions. What time the mistress wrote, whether she saw visitors, said he was a friend. I didn't like the look of him." "What look had he?" "Tall, sir. Dark coat, wore gloves." Even though it weren't cold, Whimsy exchanged a swift glance with Parker. The description, vague as it was, fitted too neatly the shadow Mrs. Clare had conjured. When the boy was gone, Parker exhaled. So we have contradictions aplenty. A neighbor too certain, a cousin too polished, a housekeeper too defensive, and now a lurking stranger. Each story smudges the edges of the truth. Whimsy smiled thinly. Yes, Parker. The truth lies in those smudges. Every false note, every contradiction, each one is a thread. And if I am not mistaken, the tapestry they conceal is beginning, ever so faintly, to show its design. The rain had ceased at last, leaving the city sharp and clear in the lamplight. Yet within the case of the widow's last letter, the air remained thick with deception, each voice carrying not clarity, but distortion, as though all conspired, whether by design or by fear, to keep the final word from being spoken. The following morning found Whimsy and Parker seated across from one another in the inspector's office. The widow's unfinished letter spread between them like a riddle written in ink and silence. Outside, London stirred with its usual bustle, but within, the case seemed to hold the room in its own peculiar gravity. Each suspect had spoken, each voice contradicting the other, and yet none rang with a note of truth complete enough to solve the mystery. Let us, Whimsy began, balancing his monocle with languid precision, review our dramatis personae, as the theatre folk say. Each of them plays a role in this curious little farce, but which is the villain and which merely provides color? Parker leaned forward, fingers steepled. Mrs. Briggs, the housekeeper, her nervousness about the pen troubles me. She had opportunity, certainly, and access to the study. But motive? None clear, unless she feared dismissal or harbored some secret grievance. True, Whimsy replied. Yet note her contradiction about the umbrella. Either she overlooked it in panic, or she sought to conceal the intruder's presence. Both possibilities weave her into the fabric, whether by accident or intent. Then there is Vane, Parker said grimly, the cousin. He gains inheritance, modest though it be, and he paints the widow as unstable, which conveniently lessens suspicion. His alibi, dining at the club, may be solid or may be contrived. But motive does not spring solely from money, Whimsy mused. Consider resentment, envy, even impatience with eccentricity. To a man of pride, even a small estate may serve as justification if combined with wounded vanity. Still, his too ready contempt is a mask. But does it hide guilt, or merely distaste? Parker flipped through his notes. Mrs. Clare, the neighbor. Eager to be useful, perhaps too eager. Her certainty about the shadow, contradicted by the dim lamp, suggests either embellishment or invention. Motive, none obvious, unless she enjoys the limelight of gossip. Do not underestimate. Whimsy warned gently, the mischief wrought by boredom and envy. A neighbor starved of intrigue may feed upon another's misfortune, embroidering truth into scandal. She may not have killed, but she clouds the water. And the boy Thomas, Parker said, softer now. He is frightened. He speaks of a stranger in gloves, that much I believe. But if the stranger exists, he may be the thread that ties these disparate motives together. Whimsy rose, pacing the narrow confines of the office. Let us imagine. Our widow receives threatening letters, burns them in fear or secrecy. One she sends away by post, perhaps to secure aid. Another she begins in desperation, interrupted before completion. Her words, "He comes tonight," suggest dread, not welcome. Into this tension step are cast a cousin with pecuniary gain, a housekeeper with guilty knowledge, a neighbor with prying eyes, a boy with secrets, and an unknown gentleman with gloves. Each has reason to distort the truth, though not all to kill. Which among them held the key to the pen, Parker? Which among them placed poison where trust was greatest? Parker frowned. If the pen itself was the weapon, only someone within the house could tamper with it. A stranger would have needed time, opportunity. Precisely, Whimsy said. Thus the intruder may not be the hand that poisoned, but the spectre that drove her terror, and those within seized upon that terror for their own design. The inspector tapped his notes. Let us consider sequence, Mrs. Briggs hears the pen scratching. At some point the intruder enters, or is imagined to enter. Mrs. Harwood writes, begins a warning, breaks off. She dies. Briggs finds her. The umbrella appears. Contradictions everywhere. Contradictions. Whimsy echoed, or but motives in disguise. Why lie about an umbrella unless its presence incriminates? Why disparage the dead unless one fears her words might yet accuse? Why embroider shadows unless one hopes to direct suspicion away? Each voice carries its deception. He stopped pacing, fixing Parker with sudden clarity. What if the motives overlap? Imagine Vane covets his inheritance. Briggs fears exposure of some past misdeed. Claire craves attention. The boy shields his aunt. Each bends the truth for selfish reason, but only one applied the fatal touch. Thus the maze of motives serves not to reveal the killer, but to conceal him among them. Parker sighed. A devil's tangle. Greed, fear, jealousy, vanity, all circling one corpse. And yet, Whimsy replied, patterns emerge. The pen, an object intimate to the house. The umbrella, an intruder's mark. The unfinished letter, a victim's cry. One among them feared her words most. One sought to silence her. Parker's eyes narrowed. You think she was about to name him? Or to reveal his purpose? Whimsy said softly. The phrase I cannot. What? I cannot pay. I cannot conceal. I cannot forgive. Each ending suggests a secret transaction. Something binding her unwillingly to another. Discover that bond, and we discover the killer. The telephone upon Parker's desk shrilled abruptly, cutting through their meditation. He snatched it up, listened, then covered the mouthpiece. It's the Yard. They've traced the letter young Thomas posted, addressed to a solicitor in Lincoln's Inn. Contents sealed, of course, but we can obtain a warrant. Whimsy's eyes gleamed. At last, Parker. A shaft of light in the labyrinth. For whatever she sent away, she wished preserved. It may contain the motive the others seek to bury. He turned back to the letter upon the desk, the ink blot spreading like a wound. But mark me, old friend, when we learn what she confessed, someone in our circle will tremble. And tremble not from grief, but from fear. For the web is woven tight, and the spider hides among them still. The day lengthened toward dusk, shadows stretching across the city, as though echoing the widow's last warning. Within that gathering darkness, motives tangled like threads in a knot, each suspect bound to the crime by greed, resentment, or vanity. Yet through the maze, Whimsy's mind pressed steadily, teasing strands apart, searching for the one true line that would lead to the heart of the deception. The warrant was secured with more ease than Parker expected, and by late afternoon he and Whimsy were ushered into the chambers of Mr. Tolson, a dry, careful solicitor who received them with the air of one reluctantly drawn into scandal. From a locked drawer he produced the letter Mrs. Harwood had sent on the day of her death. Its seal was intact, the handwriting unmistakably hers. With deliberate gravity, Tolson unfolded the single page and allowed the two men to read. The contents were blunt, a confession of fear. Mrs. Harwood wrote that she had been threatened with exposure over certain dealings of her late husband, irregularities in his shipping ventures. The letter named Henry Vane, her cousin, as the one applying pressure, demanding money to keep silence regarding the matter. She begged the solicitor to prepare protection for her estate and to see that Vane gained nothing by her death. The letter ended with the words, "He has pressed me to the limit. I do not know how much longer I can bear it. Parker let out a low whistle. There we have it, whimsy. Blackmail motive and inheritance all in one neat package. Vane is our man. Tolson, smoothing the page, added dryly, Mrs. Harwood entrusted me with similar concerns in the past, though never so explicit. I feared she would come to harm. It seems I was not wrong. By evening the Yard had acted. Vane was brought in, protesting vigorously, but the evidence appeared damning. The letter's accusation, coupled with his financial stake and disdainful attitude, painted him in the darkest colors. Newspapers clamored with headlines: cousin arrested in widow's locked room death. Inspector Parker, though cautious, allowed himself a measure of relief. It fits whimsy. The threats, the inheritance, the letter naming him. It's more than enough. Yet whimsy, lounging against the cold mantel of Parker's office, toyed with his monocle and frowned. Does it fit, old friend? Or does it merely appear to? A confession after death is a powerful thing, but consider. Why should Vane, if he truly intended murder, allow her time to put pen to paper? Why leave her alive long enough to denounce him? Parker countered. Perhaps he didn't know of the letter. Or she wrote it in secrecy, trusting the boy to post it. Perhaps. Whimsy admitted. And yet, observe the phrasing. She writes of pressure, of demands of fear. But nowhere does she hint at poison, nor at imminent violence. Only financial ruin. Blackmail, yes, but blackmail is a slow weapon, not one that strikes with deadly ink. Our widow feared disgrace, not death. Parker shifted uneasily. Are you suggesting the letter itself is misleading? Not forged, no. The hand is hers. But it names a villain too neatly, too completely. Real-life Parker seldom obliges us with signed accusations. When it does, I begin to smell orchestration. Still, procedure demanded its course. Vane was charged formally, and in the cells he railed at injustice. "She was unstable! Mad with fancies!" he shouted. "Yes, I pressed her. What of it? It was my right. But I did not kill her." His words, though tinged with arrogance, rang with a desperation not easily feigned. That night, alone with his thoughts, whimsy returned to the detail that gnawed at him. The pen. Always the pen. If Vane's weapon was extortion, why should Mrs. Harwood die with ink-stained fingers, as though the very instrument of her protest had betrayed her? He pictured again the blot on the page, the heavy antique pen, the faint chemical tang upon the nib. That was no blackmailer's tool. It was an executioner's. The following morning brought further apparent confirmation. Traces of Vane's handwriting were found in the ashes of the study grate. Snippets of a note urging payment, couched in veiled threats. Burnt evidence of his demands, seemingly destroyed by the widow in despair. The Yard congratulated itself. The case is sealed, one sergeant declared. A villainous cousin, greedy for money, cornered by his own threats. Yet whimsy, examining the fragments, noticed the ink, blue, not black. He remembered the ashes he had sifted, the edges of blue ink smudged by flame. Mrs. Harwood wrote always in black. Vane, so the solicitor confirmed, used black also in his correspondence. Who then, whimsy murmured, wrote these blue ink threats? And why destroy them in her fireplace? He turned to Parker. Suppose, old man, that someone else forged Vane's hand, planting the evidence that now condemns him. That would explain the too perfect accusation, the convenient ashes, the umbrella abandoned in haste. A frame? Parker. A devilishly neat one. Parker groaned. If you're right, then we've arrested the wrong man. But the Yard won't thank us for doubts. They like a case tied up in ribbon. Ribbons? Whimsy said dryly. Hair charming on parcels, less so on corpses. We must tug at the knot before it strangles justice. The true killer still walks free, and the widow's last words, "I cannot," remain unfinished. Perhaps it is because she was silenced not by the cousin she named, but by one who ensured she could name no other. Even as the newspapers hailed Vane's arrest as victory, Wimsey felt the hollowness of it. Too many questions hung unanswered, the pen that carried death, the housekeeper's shudder, the neighbor's embroidery, the boy's fear of a stranger. Threads dangled loose, ignored by those satisfied with a simple tale. But Wimsey, restless and unsatisfied, knew the pattern was not complete. Somewhere in the quiet streets of Bloomsbury, the true hand that had guided ink into poison and lies into truth waited, confident in the false victory now proclaimed. And until that hand was uncovered, the game was far from over. The glow of triumph at Scotland Yard had scarcely dimmed when Wimsey returned once more to the Harwood house, restless with the sense of something left unsaid. The umbrella still lay in Parker's custody, the fragments of blue, inked threats carefully bagged, but the house itself, silent, shadowed, with its smell of stale smoke and damp curtains, seemed to whisper of secrets unbothered by official proclamations. Mrs. Briggs received him stiffly, her lips pressed tight as though the arrest of Mr. Vane had closed the matter in her mind. Yet Wimsey's gaze lingered on her hands as she poured tea, fingers reddened, ink stains faint, but visible near the cuticle. "You've been writing, Mrs. Briggs?" he asked lightly. She startled, nearly spilling the pot. "Only accounts, sir. Nothing more." He let the matter pass with a smile, though his thoughts circled back to the blue ink in the grate. Not hers, perhaps, but the presence of ink stains upon her fingers in a household where only black was preferred set his mind ticking. The study remained as it had been. Wimsey drifted to the bookcase, pulling volumes at random, his fingers alighting upon a thick ledger bound in faded leather. Within were columns of figures, dates and names written in a cramped hand. Shipments, cargoes, and foreign ports, records of the late Mr. Harwood's business. Many bore neat annotations in Mrs. Harwood's handwriting, but some entries had been underlined in blue, sharp strokes pressed deep into the page. Wimsey bent over them, his lips pursed. Among the names repeated with curious regularity was that of one, Clare & Co. Shipments logged 15 years earlier, textiles, sundries, and once, marked with a discreet asterisk, pharmaceutical consignments. The name rang in his mind with a dissonant chord until it fell into place. Claire, the neighbor. Later, over brandy in Parker's office, Wimsey laid out the ledger like a conjurer revealing cards. Observe, Parker. Our late magnate's ventures were not always above board. Certain consignments, thinly veiled as textiles, carried more dubious wares. And note the name, Claire, a business partner perhaps, or at least a long-standing associate. Parker leaned close, frowning. "You mean our neighbor's family?" "Lydia Clare." "Precisely. The connection is too sharp to be coincidence. The widow's fear of exposure. The solicitor's letter naming blackmail. It may not be Vane's invention at all. Suppose Parker, that what she truly feared was the resurrection of these old dealings. Suppose someone close to those ventures threatened disclosure. Parker rubbed his chin. If Claire's family were involved, it gives our neighbor a motive far stronger than idle gossip. She might wish to conceal a tainted past, or to profit by threatening the widow with it. And yet, Wimsey mused, she embroideries shadows at windows, spins tales of tall figures. Why? To distract, perhaps. To turn the eye from herself. Her eagerness, her contradictions, they no longer read as mere vanity, but as strategy. But the maze had more turns yet. Wimsey recalled young Thomas's description of the stranger in gloves, haunting the street. He pressed the boy once more, this time with gentler patience. The lad, coaxed by Whimsy's kindness, admitted that the stranger had not merely asked questions, but pressed a coin into his hand, bidding him say nothing of the meeting. "He spoke my aunt's name," Thomas whispered. "Said she'd best remember what happened in Cardiff. Years back, Cardiff." Whimsy's mind leapt to the ledger again. Several consignments marked for that port. Dates aligned with the height of the Harwood business. Cardiff and pharmaceuticals. Then abruptly, the consignments ceased. Something had occurred. That evening Whimsy set his man Bunter to work among the archives, and by midnight an old case file lay before him. A scandal, half buried, nearly forgotten. A batch of contaminated drugs, shipped under false invoices, had poisoned dozens in Wales. The inquiry had trailed into silence when the firm collapsed under Harwood's death. Names had been whispered, but no charges pressed. The ledger now filled the gaps. Harwood's firm, with Clare & Co. as associates. The past rose like a spectre. The widow, inheriting the burden of her husband's secrets, had lived under the shadow of exposure. Someone had found the old trail, threatened to drag it into light. That was the true blackmail. Not petty debts or eccentricities, but a scandal that could ruin reputations across families. Whimsy sat long in thought. The fire dying in Parker's grate. The pattern widened Briggs with her nervous glances, perhaps more entangled than she dared admit. Claire with her embroidered tales, concealing old family stains. Vain, greedy but perhaps no murderer, caught conveniently as scapegoat, and behind them, the unknown man with gloves, invoking Cardiff as a ghost summons the dead. When dawn broke, Whimsy spoke with quiet certainty. This case, Parker, is no longer about one widow's death. It is the echo of a crime buried in the past. A crime that left victims long before Bloomsbury ever heard of poison pens. Our suspects are bound by more than circumstance. They are bound by history. And until we unearth who profits from that history's silence, we will remain prisoners of a false solution. The inspector, wary-eyed but alert, nodded slowly. Then Vane is but a shadow. The real enemy waits behind him, and waits with patience, Whimsy added softly. For the past has long arms, Parker, and it strangles in silence. The widow's letter was but the first tug upon that cord. The rest of the knot remains hidden, deep in the dark of Cardiff and Clare. Outside, the city woke to another day. But for Whimsy the light only deepened the shadows. The case had ceased to be a puzzle of locks and umbrellas. It had become the unmasking of ghosts, where every suspect stood tangled in debts unpaid and truths unspoken. And somewhere within that web, a living hand had turned the past into poison. Whimsy had never been a man to confine himself to the ordinary channels of inquiry, and as he considered the thickening strands of the Harwood affair, it occurred to him that the truth might only be coaxed into daylight by a touch of artifice. The official evidence, ledgers, threats, umbrellas, and blurred witnesses, spoke in fragments, but people, in their vanity or fear, revealed far more when pressed in ways they did not expect. He resolved upon an experiment, one part theatre and one part trap, inviting each of the central figures back to the Harwood drawing room under the pretext of final clarifications. He arranged the scene with deliberate care. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the carpet, while upon the table he laid the ledger, a sheaf of papers, and a freshly uncorked bottle of ink, blue, unmistakably vivid in the lamplight. Mrs. Briggs was the first to enter, stiff-backed and anxious. Claire followed, draped in a heavy shawl, her eyes darting curiously about the room. Vane allowed his liberty under bail, arrived with a swaggering air, but paled faintly when his gaze fell upon the ledger. Parker lingered by the door, his presence lending weight to the occasion, though it was Whimsy who orchestrated every glance, every silence. "My friends," he began, with the easy drawl that so often concealed sharp intent, "we are gathered, not to accuse but to clarify. You see before you certain records which, if fully understood, might illuminate not only the unfortunate death of Mrs. Harwood, but matters of graver antiquity. Each of you is, in one form or another, connected. Yet each insists upon innocence. Well and good. Let us then employ a simple exercise." He gestured to the bottle of ink. "This shade, as you will note, is the very blue that marked both the widow's grate and her ledger. I shall ask each of you to write a single phrase, nothing more than your own name, upon this paper. In doing so, we may compare the character of the hand with certain anonymous threats." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Briggs's lips tightened, but she obeyed swiftly, her script stiff and mechanical. Claire lifted the pen delicately, her letters curving with almost ostentatious grace. Vane hesitated, glancing from Whimsy to Parker, then scrawled his name in a hurried, uneven fashion. Whimsy collected the papers without comment, stacking them neatly beside the ledger. But the writing itself was less important than the responses. Briggs's speed bespoke fear of delay, as though the sooner she complied, the less she might betray. Claire's flourish suggested a performance, as though she sought not to conceal but to dazzle. Vane's reluctance, though natural in one under suspicion, carried the ring of a man conscious of deeper jeopardy than forgery. Then came the twist, with a lightness of tone masking steel. Whimsy produced a folded sheet from his pocket, the handwriting upon it copied laboriously by Bunter to mimic the threats, but with a subtle difference. The phrasing hinted at knowledge of the Cardiff scandal, a detail none had yet admitted aloud. He laid it flat upon the table, its blue script gleaming. "An additional note, recently delivered," he said smoothly, though in truth it had been crafted only hours before. "Curious, is it not, how the hand resembles our earlier specimens? And even more curious, how it refers to Cardiff, a matter not generally known." The effect was immediate. Briggs paled and gripped the chair for support, but it was Claire who betrayed herself most. Her composure cracked, the theatrical poise crumbling as she leaned forward sharply, eyes fixed upon the paper with naked alarm. "Cardiff!" she exclaimed, before biting back the word as if it had leapt unbidden. Whimsy's gaze, cool and unyielding, met hers across the table. "Indeed, madam, Cardiff, a city where certain consignments met an unfortunate fate. Poisoned drugs ruined lives. A scandal buried, until now." Claire's hands trembled as she drew her shawl tighter, but she did not speak. Vane, watching her intently, seized upon her silence with a sneer. "So that's it then? All this time, you've been hiding your family's mess behind the widow's skirts. And I'm the one paraded about as villain. Enough!" Parker snapped, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of agreement. But Whimsy remained serene. He had achieved what he sought. Not a confession, but a crack. Claire's outburst had revealed that she knew far more of Cardiff than she had ever admitted. More than any casual neighbor could. Still, he pressed the advantage gently, as one might coax a bird closer to the net. "Consider, Mrs. Clare, that silence now serves only to deepen suspicion. Better to speak plainly. Were you or your family entangled with Harwood's ventures? Was the widow's death a desperate bid to suppress that past?" Claire drew herself upright, summoning fragments of her old hauteur. "You twist words, Lord Whimsy. I knew of Cardiff only through rumour, whispered in drawing-rooms years ago. Nothing more." Yet her denial rang hollow. The room felt it. Briggs shifting uneasily, Vane smirking with malicious satisfaction. Whimsy, satisfied with the fissure he had created, chose not to force the matter further. Instead, he leaned back, smiling faintly. "Very well. We shall let the matter rest for now. But mark me, madam, the past has an uncanny habit of scratching at locked doors, much like a stray cat at night. And some doors, once opened, refuse to close." As the suspects departed one by one, Parker turned to him in quiet wonder. "That was no evidence. Whimsy, merely a play-acting trick." "A trick, yes," Whimsy agreed cheerfully, tapping the false letter. "But sometimes, my dear Parker, the play reveals more truth than the ledger. We have flushed a bird from cover. Claire's slip tells us she carries knowledge too precise for innocence. Now, we must discover whether she is merely guardian of a shameful past, or the very hand that turned that past into murder." Outside, the wind stirred in the bare trees of Bloomsbury, whispering like voices half heard. Whimsy felt the case turning upon its axis, shifting from shadows to sharper outlines. The unconventional clue had done its work. A single word, Cardiff, had unlocked more than a dozen denials. And in that crack of deception, he glimpsed the shape of the truth waiting to be drawn forth. The morning after Claire's slip, Whimsy awoke to the uneasy certainty that the game had changed. He breakfasted without appetite, scanning the newspapers for any mention of Cardiff, but finding none. The silence itself was telling. Too many had an interest in keeping that scandal buried. He sent Bunter with instructions to guard the ledger and the forged letter, those two fragile pivots upon which his investigation now balanced, while he himself went to confer with Parker. When he returned to his rooms that afternoon, the air held the faint smell of scorched paper. At once his heart sank. Bunter, impeccable as always, stood at attention, his face unusually grave. "I regret to report, my lord," he said quietly, "that despite my vigilance, the ledger has been tampered with. The ink-stained pages are gone. Only the harmless accounts remain." Whimsy snatched the volume and rifled through it. The damning pages, those with the blue, inked annotations linking Harwood to the Cardiff consignments, had been neatly excised with a razor. No clumsy tearing, no hurried theft. It was the work of a precise hand, one that had known exactly what to remove. "How?" Whimsy demanded, though his tone was less anger than calculation. "During your absence, a gentleman calling himself Inspector Tolliver presented a warrant, complete with seal. I telephoned the Yard at once, only to find no such inspector exists. By then, the fellow had already gone, ledger in hand. I retrieved it after discovering it discarded in the alley, mutilated as you see." For a moment Whimsy simply stared at the mutilated book, his mind racing. This was no ordinary adversary. To forge official papers, to walk unchallenged into his own rooms, to excise the single thread that bound Cardiff to Harwood, that bespoke both boldness and intimate knowledge of the investigation. Someone was not merely hiding but actively erasing the trail. That evening, he shared the discovery with Parker in a low voice over whiskey at the Cattles. Parker swore under his breath. This is deliberate sabotage. The case was edging close to exposure, and now we're left with scraps. Worse, someone inside the Yard may have tipped them off. How else could they know what to take? The suggestion of betrayal cast a chill over both men. Whimsy drummed his fingers on the glass. Trust, old friend, grows as fragile as gossamer. We must assume that every word spoken too freely finds its way to ears we cannot see. Henceforth, we play our cards close indeed. The next blow came swiftly. The false letter, the one Bunter had crafted and which had so effectively rattled Claire, vanished overnight from Whimsy's locked desk. No forced entry, no sign of disturbance. Yet the drawer lay open, its contents disturbed. Whoever had excised the ledger's pages now sought to remove every instrument by which Whimsy had unbalanced the suspects. The timing was too neat to be coincidence. Claire had faltered at the mention of Cardiff. Vane had gloated at her discomfort. Briggs had trembled but held her tongue. And now, as if choreographed, the key tokens of evidence were vanishing, as though a careful hand were sweeping the chessboard clean before whimsy could call checkmate. He walked the fog-bound streets that night, pipe clamped between his teeth, sifting possibilities. Who had the most to gain by silencing Cardiff? Claire's reaction had been damning, but she alone could hardly command such calculated interference. Vane, for all his bluster, lacked the subtlety. Briggs, nervous, impoverished, desperate, might serve as pawn but never as architect, which left the shadow behind them all a figure with resources, with reach, and with the coolness to strike at the heart of the inquiry. Yet the theft carried another implication. If the true enemy feared these pieces of evidence, then whimsy had been right in their significance. The mutilated ledger and vanished letter were themselves a confession. Someone had moved mountains to destroy them, because they contained the seeds of truth. When Parker pressed him the following day for direction, Whimsy's response was grim. "We proceed as though the evidence remains in hand. Let them think they have crippled us. A man who believes the record expunged grows careless, speaks more freely. And words, unlike ink, cannot be excised so neatly once uttered." Still, he could not disguise the weight upon his mind. Every hour lost was an hour in which the adversary could strike again, perhaps not at papers next time, but at people. Already Claire had retreated into her home, refusing further interviews. Vane swaggered about the city with renewed boldness, crowing of his supposed vindication. Briggs, haggard and fearful, begged Whimsy for protection against unseen enemies. The case, once tangled but navigable, now teetered on the edge of chaos. Without the ledger's pages, how could Cardiff be proved? Without the letter, how could Claire's slip be leveraged? Each missing piece widened the gulf between suspicion and proof. Yet Whimsy's resolve hardened in proportion. "They think to frighten me into retreat," he told Parker as they studied the mutilated book under a dim lamp. "But they have overplayed their hand. To erase is to admit existence. We shall find other traces. Ink leaves stains, Parker, even when the page is cut away. And so do men who live in fear of discovery." He was right. For though the evidence had vanished, its absence shouted louder than presence. Somewhere among his shrinking circle of suspects, guilt had stirred sufficiently to risk exposure. The challenge now was not merely to uncover the truth, but to protect it from obliteration, before the shadowed adversary struck again. And as Whimsy set down the mutilated ledger with deliberate care, he understood that the hunt had turned personal. The enemy no longer feared the authorities. They feared him. And that, though perilous, was an advantage he meant to exploit. The chill in Bloomsbury had deepened when Whimsy arrived at the Harwood house the following morning. Gas lamps flickered in the fog, casting distorted shadows across the pavement, and an uneasy silence hung over the street, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Parker met him at the door, pale and harried, clutching a telegram. "It's bad, Whimsy," Parker said immediately, thrusting the paper into his hands. "A Mrs. Briggs. She's missing." Whimsy read the terse message. "Housekeeper has failed to appear this morning. Neighbors report no movement. Investigation underway." His eyes narrowed. Briggs had been frightened enough already. Now, her absence suggested more than mere whim. They hurried through the house, searching room by room. Drawers had been rifled again, cupboards left ajar. The umbrella, once a quiet clue, lay discarded in the hallway. On the desk, a single note, written in the same neat, deliberate hand as the earlier blue ink threats, was pinned under a paperweight Do not meddle further, or the next will be yours. Parker's jaw tightened. It's a threat. They've gone after Briggs because she might speak. Or to frighten us. Whimsy, eyes scanning every corner, allowed himself only a brief nod. Indeed. But the method is telling. No violence yet, just disappearance. Someone capable, precise, wishing to silence witnesses without leaving evidence. The villain is bold, but cautious. Or supremely confident. A sudden knock at the door startled them. A young messenger delivered a telegram addressed to Whimsy. He tore it open and read quickly, Miss Clare injured. Found unconscious in her flat. Call police. 2 in one morning. Parker muttered grimly. The web widens. Whimsy. Someone's taking preemptive steps. Whimsy's mind raced, tracing the connections. Briggs' disappearance, Claire's assault, the missing ledger, the vanished letter. They were no longer merely pieces of evidence. They were warnings. The adversary had become proactive, seeking to erase the past before Whimsy could exploit it. And, more dangerously, he now understood that the detective himself was a threat. They drove immediately to Claire's flat. She lay upon the faintly rumpled couch, pale but conscious, attended by a doctor. The scarf she wore was singed in places, evidence of a struggle near the gas stove. Her eyes flicked open when she saw Whimsy. Fear mingled with relief. They came in. She whispered hoarsely, the man he wanted the ledger. I tried to hide it. Hey. He struck me when I resisted. I don't know who he was. Gloves, dark coat, voice low, calm. Whimsy noted the trembling in her fingers, the lingering burn on her scarf. You resisted bravely, he said softly, and you acted correctly by concealing the ledger. Tell me, did he mention Cardiff? Her eyes widened in terror. Yes, he said. Do not let Cardiff see the light again. The phrase struck like a bell. The villain's motive was now indisputable. Cardiff was the hinge upon which the entire conspiracy turned. Whoever had struck Claire and spirited Briggs away had intimate knowledge of the ledger, its significance, and the threats it implied. The same figure had orchestrated both attacks, moving with precision, eliminating witnesses. Parker paced the room. This complicates matters. If he can act so freely, what hope have we of protecting the remaining witnesses? And of catching him before he strikes again? Whimsy, seated and steepling his fingers, allowed himself a thin smile. Therein lies the advantage of boldness. The villain believes he is unobserved, but in acting aggressively, he leaves patterns. Predictable patterns. Observe. Each attack follows exposure. The ledger's mutilation, Claire's slip at Cardiff, Briggs' trembling admission. He reacts to information, not whim. If we feed him controlled intelligence, we can anticipate his next move. Parker frowned. Controlled intelligence. You mean a trap? Precisely, Whimsy said. But first we must understand his reach. He has tools, courage, and patience. That tells me he is not one of our minor players. Not vain, not a timid housekeeper. He is someone connected to Cardiff, to the old Harwood scandal. He knows the ledger, the letters, and the possible ramifications. We have underestimated him until now. And until we acknowledge his sophistication, the next victim may be inevitable. Whimsy left Claire under Parker's protection, then moved swiftly to check the alley where Bunter had found the mutilated ledger. Small details that had seemed unimportant before now suggested more than random chance. Footprints faintly impressed in the mud. A smear of blue ink on the cobblestones matching the earlier letters, and, curiously, a scrap of paper caught under a drainpipe. Small, almost insignificant, but deliberately left. Whimsy picked it up with gloved fingers. It bore a single word in careful script soon. He pressed it to the lamplight, examining the hand. Not Claire's, not Vane's, not Briggs'. The strokes were deliberate, artistic, controlled, a professional hand. The message was not merely a threat, it was a challenge, a signal that the villain was watching, manipulating, waiting. Returning to Parker, Whimsy laid out the scrap. Observe, Parker. He wants us to feel powerless. But this scrap is a breadcrumb, and breadcrumbs, if followed, lead to the source. He has acted to intimidate, to confuse, to erase. Yet even in destruction he leaves himself exposed. And now we must consider which remaining player has motive sufficient to commit murder, the cunning to evade detection, and the audacity to strike repeatedly at witnesses. Parker's eyes narrowed. That leaves Claire Briggs, or someone connected to Cardiff. But Briggs is missing, Claire is recovering. Who else could move so freely? Whimsy tapped the table. Think wider, Parker. The stranger in gloves we discussed before, the one Thomas saw near the house? He has emerged not as a figure of casual menace, but as a calculated operative, connected to a history stretching back years. We are dealing with a criminal who has woven past and present into one continuous thread. And unless we unravel it, the next strike may not be against evidence, but against life itself, including our own. The fog deepened outside, and with it came a sense of inevitability. The case had shifted from inquiry to pursuit, from understanding to survival. The ledger's missing pages, the vanished letter, the assaults, the warnings, they were the work of a mind several steps ahead, watching, anticipating. Whimsy felt a chill, not of fear, but of recognition. The villain was no longer merely hiding in shadows. He had stepped fully into the game, daring the detective to respond. And respond Whimsy would. But first, he must predict the next move, shield those still vulnerable, and confront a foe whose patience and cunning had turned a simple investigation into a dangerous chase through history, deception, and murder. The hunt had become urgent, and the stakes had never been higher. Whimsy returned late that evening to the Harwood house, the fog outside thickening into a cold, almost impenetrable pall. The city's lights glimmered faintly through the mist, but inside, the rooms were quiet, almost oppressively so. He moved slowly, examining familiar corners as though they might suddenly reveal a hidden thread. It was there, amid the mundane, an abandoned ledger stub, a slight smudge on a doorknob, a chair subtly out of place, that the pattern began to assert itself. For weeks, the investigation had seemed a series of disconnected events: the widow's death, Vane's blackmail, Claire's panic, Briggs' disappearance, the mutilated ledger, and the vanished letter. Each seemed random, each left by different hands, each deliberately designed to confuse. Yet now, standing in the study, Whimsy felt the invisible thread tighten, drawing those fragments into a single, coherent design. He recalled the moment when Claire had blanched at the word Cardiff, the tremor in her hands, the precision of her handwriting when faced with the forged note. He remembered Briggs' nervous gestures, the faint ink stains she had sought to conceal, the meticulous care with which she had hidden small ledgers and scraps of paper. Even Vane's bluster, the overconfidence he had displayed after being falsely accused, seemed to fall into place, not as the driver of events, but as a useful distraction planted by someone else entirely. And then, Whimsy's eyes alighted on a detail so small it had escaped notice until now. A set of ink stains on the underside of a writing desk drawer, barely perceptible, as though transferred from a hand that had moved quickly but deliberately. The blue ink matched the threads, but the pattern of smudges suggested more than hurried action. It indicated the habitual movement of someone accustomed to concealing evidence, someone who had handled ledger and letter with care and practiced precision. Suddenly, the sequence of events became clearer. The intruder's timing had never been random, Each act, Briggs' disappearance, Claire's assault, the removal of the ledger's pages, followed an invisible rhythm. Always immediately after Whimsy had gained some small insight or the yard had taken a step toward what appeared to be a solution. The villain was reacting to the investigation, anticipating it, yet not entirely concealing the same hand that orchestrated the attacks. Whimsy bent over the desk and ran his finger along the faint blue streaks. It struck him how methodical the markings were, precisely aligned with the ledger's former pages. They suggested movement, a habitual rote, repeated often, not a single act of theft. In other words, the person responsible had a routine within the house, knew its every corner, and had leveraged that knowledge to manipulate events while remaining ostensibly invisible. And then it clicked, the subtle cue that had been present all along. During the initial interviews, Whimsy had noticed Mrs. Briggs always placed the same teacup in the same spot, adjusted the same chair, moved in a deliberate arc through the room, almost ritualistically. At the time, it had seemed a mark of eccentricity, of nervous habit. But now, in the context of the smudged ink, the removed pages, and the precise timing of each threatening action, it revealed the unspoken truth. Briggs was not merely a frightened witness. She had been, perhaps unwillingly, the instrument of the villain's plans within the house, her knowledge and position exploited to move evidence, conceal acts, and provide the murderer with a channel of manipulation. Yet there was more. Whimsy's mind returned to Vane. His arrogance, his smug claims of innocence, his gloating over Claire's discomfort, all were elements in a staged tableau designed to mislead. By drawing attention to Vane, the real villain had redirected suspicion, shaping perception so that anyone less astute might have declared the case solved. The pattern now suggested not just reaction but foresight, a meticulous orchestration in which Briggs, the housekeeper, may have been complicit unwittingly or coerced. Another faint detail revealed itself, the umbrella. Initially, it had seemed a mere incongruity, a casual marker of intrusion. But reconsidered alongside the ink smudges, the precise timing, and Briggs' habitual movements, it formed a subtle signature. The villain left traces deliberately minimal yet consistent, calculated to guide observers toward a false conclusion while concealing the true method. Whimsy sank into a chair, pipe in hand, piecing together the mental map. Cardiff, the ledger, the forged letter, Claire's faltering. Briggs' routines, all were nodes in a network. And the network, when traced backward, led inexorably to one conclusion. The orchestrator of the entire chain was someone with both intimate knowledge of Harwood's past dealings and access to the present domestic circle. Someone who could move silently within the house, manipulate witnesses, and conceal evidence without leaving obvious marks. A master of subtlety and timing. He glanced at Parker, who had been observing quietly. You see now, Parker, that the chaos was deliberate, a carefully constructed smokescreen. Each act of intimidation, each disappearance, each destroyed document was not random, but a single thread woven into a tapestry. And the smallest of details, Briggs' habitual motions, the ink smudges, the umbrella, were the skeleton key. Parker's brow furrowed. So all this time, the answer was staring at us. Hidden in the everyday, the trivial. Exactly, Whimsy said. We sought grand gestures, dramatic clues, when in fact the truth had been whispering through the mundane. The villain relied on our expectation of chaos to conceal order. And now that we see the pattern, we can anticipate the next move, isolate the danger, and finally expose the hand behind both past and present crimes. He rose and began pacing the study, eyes flicking from desk to fireplace, from bookcase to window sill. Each minor inconsistency, each overlooked habit, fell into place. Observe, Parker, the pattern is not only spatial. It is temporal. Each act follows our observations, exploiting them. Whoever does this watches us, studies us, and acts with precision. But patterns can be traced. Timing, repetition, habit, all are predictable once recognized. A sudden thought struck him. The missing ledger pages, the vanished letter, Briggs' absence, Claire's assault. They were all attempts to disrupt the pattern, to prevent recognition. But recognition had arrived, and with recognition came power. Whimsy paused, fingers steepled, mind working rapidly. We have a living map now. By positioning ourselves correctly, observing the habitual cues, and controlling the flow of information, we can force the villain into action on our terms. The same meticulousness that protected him thus far can now be used to entrap him. The skeleton key is in plain sight, Parker, and the door it opens will reveal the truth in full. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, heavy and unyielding, yet within the study, a new clarity had emerged. The chaos, once overwhelming, was now legible. Every seemingly insignificant act had its purpose, every minor detail its place in the design. The pattern was no longer a mystery, it was a map, and Whimsy, at last, knew the path he must follow to confront the villain, to protect the vulnerable, and to bring long-buried crimes into the light. The hunt had shifted from reaction to strategy. The villain, so far several steps ahead, would now find the detective anticipating, predicting, and maneuvering with a precision equal to his own. The final act was drawing near, and with the pattern revealed, the forces of order were poised to strike. Whimsy spent the following day retracing every step of the investigation, moving from the Harwood house to Claire's flat, to the narrow alleys where the ledger had been discarded, and finally to the yard's archives. Each location, each fragment of evidence, began to align not just spatially or temporally, but psychologically. The villain's hand, once invisible, now left faint but consistent traces in human behavior, in choices of timing, in subtle manipulations. What emerged was not only method but motive, a deeper logic that surpassed mere greed or revenge. It had begun, as all human obsessions do, with fear. Not fear of discovery, not fear of financial ruin, but the fear of personal obliteration, the annihilation of identity and legacy. The Cardiff scandal had left shadows across generations. Families, once associated with prosperity and social prominence, had been tainted by whispers of poisoned shipments, ruined lives, and half-forgotten legal inquiries. Most had buried it quietly, some had moved away, changed names, or allowed themselves the luxury of forgetting. But the villain, as Whimsy now realized, had never forgotten. Claire's reactions, Briggs' nervous compliance, Vane's bluster, all were chess pieces in a game designed to eliminate threats to a reputation so carefully constructed it had become the very essence of the criminal's self-concept. Whimsy reviewed the blue ink smudges, the obliterated ledger pages, the vanished letter, and the threats themselves. They were all part of a campaign not merely to conceal, but to control the narrative of history itself. The breakthrough came when he examined the offhand remark Claire had made during one of their interviews. Some debts, once incurred, are never repaid in money. At the time, it had seemed an affectation, a melodramatic flourish, but now it revealed its truth. The villain's crimes were not transactional, they were existential. The ledger, the letters, the attempts to silence witnesses, all were efforts to enforce a balance, a moral equation only comprehensible to the mind that sought to preserve a family legacy at any cost. Parker, seated across from him at the catalyst, listened in silent awe as Whimsy laid out the reasoning. The widow's death, Briggs' disappearance, Claire's assault, these were not acts of sudden malice. They were preemptive strikes, psychological measures calculated to prevent exposure. The villain sought more than money or revenge. They sought immortality of the family name, protection of a carefully curated identity, and elimination of anyone who might tarnish it. Parker shook his head, trying to comprehend. So, this is obsession? Madness. Whimsy smiled faintly. Obsession, yes, but rooted in a peculiar form of logic. The villain believed that by controlling perception, by removing witnesses, destroying records, and steering suspicion, they could manipulate history itself. The ledger was not only evidence, it was a threat to existence as they defined it. The Cardiff scandal was the seed, and the widow's attempts to preserve honesty were the weeds threatening to overtake it. He returned to the house the next day, pacing slowly through the rooms where the attacks had occurred. The faint scuff marks in the hallway, the subtle rearrangement of furniture, the smudges of blue ink, each revealed not clumsiness but careful orchestration. Whimsy realized that the villain had repeatedly entered the house, not in passion but with ritualistic precision. And each visit, each manipulation, had been calculated to maintain psychological dominance over all present. A quiet knock at the study door made him glance up. Briggs entered, pale, hesitant, but no longer trembling as she had before. Whimsy gestured for her to sit, his expression gentle. "You are safe here, Mrs. Briggs. But I need you to speak freely. Tell me everything you know, every movement, every instruction you may have been given." Her eyes filled with tears. "I only did what I was told. I moved papers, hid notes. He said it was for the good of the family. If I had refused, he said the past would destroy all of us. I never meant for anyone to be hurt." Whimsy's eyes softened, but did not waver. "You see now, Mrs. Briggs, that you were part of a larger pattern. But the mind that guided you has been revealed. What you feared was not merely discovery. It was erasure. The villain would destroy anyone who threatened their self-image, their legacy. Do you understand?" She nodded, trembling. "Yes, oh, yes. And the ledger? The letter, he wanted them gone to protect himself, to protect them. He thought the past could be buried forever." "Exactly." Whimsy leaned back, letting the clarity sink in. The villain's motive was psychological at its core, the preservation of self, the control of history, the domination of perception. The physical crimes, the widow's death, Claire's assault, were extensions of that inner need, executed with meticulous care and without hesitation. Money and inheritance were mere tools, not ends. Later, in conversation with Parker, Whimsy connected the final dots. Notice, Parker, the sophistication of the attacks. Each action was designed to manipulate not only witnesses but the investigators. By forcing errors, destroying evidence selectively, and creating the illusion of randomness, the villain masked a deeply personal motive. They were compelled not by immediate gain, but by an almost pathological need to control how history remembered them, to insulate themselves from shame or consequence. Parker's hand tightened around his cup. So everything, the threats, the blue ink, the forged letters, was just a means to protect the ego. Precisely. And that explains the extreme lengths they would go to murder, assault, intimidation. To the villain, these were rational steps, necessary to preserve the integrity of a narrative only they fully understood. That is why ordinary logic fails when confronting them. Their moral compass is aligned not with law, but with a personal code in which the family name and the past are sacrosanct. Whimsy returned to the study late at night alone, and allowed himself to marvel at the revelation. The case had grown from a simple mystery into a study of human obsession, of how fear and pride could twist morality into a weapon. Every previously inexplicable act, the careful destruction of the ledger, The vanishing letter. The psychological manipulations now revealed itself as a cog in a machine designed to protect identity above all else. And there, in that quiet room, Whimsy understood fully the villain was not merely a criminal, but a person driven by a compulsion, a desperate desire to dominate the past and control the narrative of life and death. The revelation was chilling in its clarity. The crime, while outwardly about inheritance, blackmail, or scandal, had been motivated by the deep, hidden terror of being rendered insignificant by history itself. The hidden motive was exposed, its logic perverse but undeniable. Whimsy lit his pipe and gazed out into the foggy night, knowing that while understanding the villain's psychology was essential, it also meant recognizing the lengths to which they would go to preserve that fragile world. The case had shifted into its final, perilous stage. Not only to uncover the murderer, but to anticipate the extremes of a mind obsessed with control, and to bring that hidden terror into the light before it struck once more. The following evening, Whimsy stood in the dimly lit drawing room of the Harwood house, Bunter quietly arranging chairs behind him, and Parker lingering near the doorway, alert but restrained. The storm outside had intensified, rain lashing against the windows, wind rattling the panes. The room smelled faintly of pipe smoke and polished wood, an ordinary domestic scent masking the extraordinary tension that now hung in the air. Every detail had been considered, the ledger carefully restored under Whimsy's guidance, the forged letter recreated and placed conspicuously, and subtle hints of exposure, Claire's renewed courage, Briggs' tentative compliance, arranged to provoke the villain into action. It was a simple trap. Deceptively so, Whimsy understood that the adversary's psychology, the obsessive need to protect reputation, to control perception, to eliminate threats, would dictate the next move. And he had placed all the necessary lures: evidence, witnesses, and the illusion of vulnerability. A quiet knock drew Whimsy's attention. Briggs, pale but resolute, ushered in the final figure. The intruder entered with the casual grace of familiarity. Gloves neatly fitted, coat clean, eyes calculating every corner of the room. Claire followed behind, nervous but composed, her gaze fixed on the newcomer. "So," Whimsy said, leaning lightly against the mantelpiece, "you have come at last. I confess, we were beginning to think that our friend Cardiff had rendered you cautious, perhaps too cautious to appear at all." The intruder's eyes flickered, a subtle tightening at the corners, but otherwise nothing betrayed him. "Lord Whimsy," he said smoothly, voice low and controlled, "I must admit, your persistence is remarkable. But what proof have you? Words? Papers? The past, perhaps, that you claim to resurrect?" Whimsy's smile was serene, almost imperceptibly amused. "All of the above," he replied. "And yet, I am less concerned with proof than with understanding. Understanding why one would go to such lengths to manipulate, to intimidate, to silence. And you, sir, are the architect of all of it." The intruder's posture stiffened, but his composure remained intact. "Architect? I assure you, I am merely protecting what must be protected." "Is that so reprehensible?" "Reprehensible," Whimsy echoed. "Perhaps not to one who views history and reputation as sacred. But murder, threats, the destruction of evidence, these are measures beyond protection. You miscalculated the subtlety of human observation. You assumed that those around you could be easily manipulated. Yet each act you took, each smear, each carefully timed disappearance, revealed a pattern too precise to remain invisible forever." A flicker of annoyance passed across the intruder's face, quickly masked. "And what of it?" he asked. "You believe yourself clever enough to deduce intent from scraps of ink and a few inconvenienced witnesses. I believe myself clever enough to recognize fear and obsession when they drive men to extremes," Whimsy said, stepping closer, the firelight catching his eyes. "You were compelled by more than money or revenge. Cardiff, the ledger, the letters. They were threats not merely to your fortune, but to the continuity of your identity, your carefully cultivated legacy. And in protecting it, you committed crimes of which you now stand accused." The intruder laughed softly, almost mockingly. "Identity, legacy, such grandiose terms. You presume to understand what compels me, Lord Whimsy, but you only see fragments. I act from necessity, not malice. I have preserved the family name. Without intervention, the shame of the past would have ruined everything. And yet," Whimsy said calmly, "the method you chose betrayed you. Each act, each disappearance, each destroyed page, followed the rhythm of your obsession. You moved with precision, yes, but also with predictability. The ink stains, the habitual movements, the misdirection. They left a trail for those trained to read them. And I have read them all." The intruder's hand twitched subtly toward his coat pocket. Parker stiffened. Bunter stepped slightly forward. Whimsy did not move, his gaze steady. "You will not find a clean escape," he said softly. "You are trapped by your own design. One last desperate act will only confirm what is already evident." The intruder's eyes darted around, calculating, weighing options, realizing perhaps for the first time that his ingenuity had been anticipated. His lips pressed together, jaw tightening. Then, as though yielding to inevitability, he sank into a chair, removing his gloves slowly, deliberately, almost ritualistically. "You see, Lord Whimsy," he said quietly, voice tense, "I have acted as any rational person would. And yet here I am, unmasked, exposed by the very patterns I sought to control. Perhaps you are right. Perhaps I underestimated the observer." Whimsy inclined his head. "Not underestimated, merely anticipated. You relied on chaos and fear to shield you, but the human mind, when observant, can discern order even in apparent disorder. You sought to erase the past, to dominate the present, to control perception itself. And in doing so, you left the faintest of threads for an attentive eye to follow." For a long moment, the intruder remained silent, eyes downcast, the tension in the room nearly unbearable. Then, slowly, he spoke, voice low but clear. "It was necessary. Every act, every threat, every manipulation was necessary to prevent the ruin of a life built on the careful cultivation of family reputation. I could not allow history to claim us, to brand us with the mistakes of the past. I acted to protect, even if others suffered." Whimsy's gaze did not waver. "You acted to protect yourself, and in doing so, you destroyed the lives of others. That is the essence of the crime. The moral fracture that cannot be justified. You will answer for it, not in abstract terms, but in law. And now, with all the pieces before you, your motives revealed, and your actions traced, there is nowhere left to hide." The intruder exhaled slowly, a mixture of relief and resignation in his expression. "So it ends, then. All my careful measures, my planning. And it ends in a single evening." "Yes," Whimsy replied, the faintest smile playing at his lips. "Because patterns, when observed, cannot lie. The truth is patient, and the patient eye sees what chaos cannot conceal. Your obsession has led you here, and now it is time to face what follows from the choices you have made." Outside, the storm began to abate, the wind easing, rain softening against the windows. Inside, the room was still except for the quiet breathing of those present. The confrontation had been tense, fraught with the potential for sudden violence, yet it had been resolved not by force, but by understanding. The comprehension of motive, the recognition of patterns, the calm assertion of reason. The villain, finally unmasked, sat before Whimsy, stripped of illusions, his psychology laid bare. And as Parker moved to signal the authorities waiting discreetly outside, Whimsy allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The case, which had begun with an apparently unsolvable crime and grown into a labyrinth of deception, threats, and obsession, had reached its climax. The pieces were finally in place, the danger neutralized, and the truth, long buried beneath layers of manipulation, was at last fully revealed. Whimsy lit his pipe and regarded the intruder with composed curiosity. "All that remains," he said, "is the reckoning. And thanks to careful observation, meticulous deduction, and an eye for the smallest detail, the reckoning is no longer yours alone to dictate." Outside, the first glimmers of dawn pierced the dissipating fog, heralding not only a new day, but the resolution of a complex and perilous puzzle, meticulously unraveled and finally brought into the light. The first rays of morning crept through the blinds as Whimsy and Parker watched the authorities lead the confessed intruder from the Harwood house. The tension of the previous night had eased into a sense of closure. The pieces had fallen into place, the motive laid bare, and the criminal brought to justice. Briggs, reassured and no longer trembling, had returned quietly to her duties, while Claire, pale but composed, sipped tea in the corner, the ledger and letter restored safely to their places. Whimsy allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction, reviewing in his mind the sequence of deductions, the patterns, the psychological threads that had led to the unmasking. Yet, as he lit his pipe and exhaled a thin curl of smoke, a faint unease pricked at him. A sense that something was not entirely resolved, that the calm might be deceptive. Parker noticed the change in expression. Still troubled, "My lord, I can never dismiss a feeling such as this," Whimsy replied. "Cases are rarely so neat as they appear when a confession is made. The mind that manipulates evidence and witnesses often leaves subtler traces that may elude even careful observation." He returned to the study, examining the ledger once more, noting the meticulous excisions and the peculiar timing of each smudge, each note, each threat. Something nagged at him. An overlooked detail in the arrangement of evidence that suggested orchestration beyond the confessed intruder's reach. He picked up a fragment of paper that had lain folded under the ledger's edge, a scrap he had barely noticed before. It bore a signature in delicate, almost feminine script, unlike the villain's bold hand. Whimsy's eyes narrowed. "Curious," he murmured, tracing the letters. Someone else was here. Someone who left instructions. Someone who influenced the flow of events behind the scenes. This was not the work of one mind alone. Parker leaned over his shoulder, frowning. "You mean an accomplice?" "Perhaps," Whimsy replied. "Or perhaps someone who manipulated both villain and victims without ever appearing openly." Notice the subtleties in timing, the way each act provoked others into revealing weaknesses. The intruder confessed, yes, but his knowledge was not absolute. He did not know everything, could not anticipate the patterns we have observed. A sudden memory returned. The moment Claire had shown hesitation, not merely fear, when questioned about Cardiff. The slight tremor in her hand, the careful avoidance of certain topics, the nervous way she had rearranged papers. At the time, Whimsy had attributed it to trauma. But the fragment of paper, the delicate script, and the subtle orchestration suggested otherwise. Claire herself may have had a role far more complex than he had realized. He rose, pacing the room, connecting dots with the renewed intensity of insight. Each act of manipulation, each diversion, each deliberate mistake, fit neatly with an overarching influence that was not the confessed intruder. Someone had been pulling the strings, guiding events to produce chaos, and yet shaping outcomes in a way that preserved the integrity of the ultimate truth. The sophistication implied a mind attuned to strategy, capable of both subtlety and foresight, and familiar with the personalities involved. Whimsy's thoughts returned to Briggs. Her fear had been genuine, but her compliance could also have been guided, influenced by quiet instructions or suggestions, small nudges that directed behavior without explicit command. And then there was the ledger itself, meticulously restored yet with minor discrepancies, small annotations, marginal notes, nearly invisible marks, that hinted at a hand far more deliberate than a panicked housekeeper could produce. He turned to Parker. "Observe Parker." The confessed intruder was a visible force, a man of action and bold measures. But there is another mind at work, a shadow intelligence, shaping events from the periphery. The confessions, the assaults, the destroyed evidence, all were pieces in a larger design. And this design leads not to Cardiff, not to the ledger, but to someone who benefits from exposure while remaining unseen. Parker's eyes widened. "Are you saying the real mastermind is still free?" Whimsy inclined his head slowly. "Yes." The confessed intruder acted to protect himself, to fulfill his own compulsions, but he was not the architect of the entire sequence. He was, in essence, a pawn in a game played by a more cunning adversary, someone who anticipated his moves and used him to manipulate witnesses, to divert attention, to control perception. A sudden recollection struck Whimsy with force, the afternoon when Claire had lingered unusually long over a cup of tea, observing the discarded ledger and the notes Bunter had placed for her review. Her eyes had not merely reflected fear, they had reflected calculation. A slight smile, almost imperceptible, had crossed her lips as she turned each page, pausing over certain passages. At the time, Whimsy had attributed it to relief or lingering anxiety. Now, in the context of the fragment of paper and the subtle orchestration of events, it suggested something far more deliberate. Claire may have been guiding the intruder, subtly influencing his actions to produce outcomes favorable to her own objectives. He recalled her hesitation when asked about Cardiff, her choice of words, and the delicate manipulation of the narrative. Each subtlety, previously dismissed as trauma or fear, now appeared intentional, almost surgical. The evidence that had seemed to incriminate the intruder might in truth have been leveraged by Claire, shaping the path to confession while shielding her own involvement. Whimsy's mind raced. The final twist was clear: the case, which had seemed closed with the intruder's confession, was not resolved. The true mastermind, someone with access, intelligence, and an understanding of human psychology, had remained in the shadows, guiding events, using both threats and timing to achieve a larger objective. The question now was not simply to interpret evidence, but to anticipate the final move of someone whose cunning rivaled the detective's own. He signaled Parker to follow him to Claire's flat. The air was tense, the storm outside easing into a steady drizzle. As they entered, Claire greeted them with cautious composure, a faint tension in her shoulders. Whimsy studied her carefully, noting the slightest shifts in expression, the careful placement of papers, the subtle alignment of objects that could hardly have been accidental. "My lord," Claire said softly, "I hope the intruder's confession has brought peace." Whimsy's gaze held her steady. "It has brought clarity, perhaps. But clarity can also conceal, if one does not account for the larger design. Tell me, Miss Claire, were you ever truly unaware of the events as they unfolded?" A flicker of hesitation crossed her face, quickly masked by composure. I only sought to protect the ledger, to ensure that justice, in the end, would prevail." Whimsy allowed the words to hang in the room. They were neither admission nor denial, but the careful phrasing, the deliberate ambiguity, and the almost imperceptible tension in her posture spoke volumes. The true mastermind had revealed herself in the smallest details. The calculated pauses, the careful choice of words, the subtle manipulation of both witnesses and villain. He leaned back, steepling his fingers, mind racing. The final stage of the investigation had begun. The confessed intruder was secured, the visible threat neutralized. But the larger game, the true orchestration of events, remained in play. And Whimsy knew, with a certainty born of meticulous deduction, that the genius of the hidden mastermind would be tested against his own in the delicate, final dance of revelation, strategy, and unmasking. Outside, the rain fell steadily, the city quiet except for the muted rhythm against the windows. Inside, the detective and the true architect of the chaos faced each other, words unspoken but laden with tension. As the last-minute twist unfolded, a challenge of intellect, observation, and will determining whether the final truth would emerge fully or remain concealed beneath layers of cunning and control. The room was silent except for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, each second echoing the tension that had accumulated over days of investigation. Whimsy remained seated, pipe in hand, observing Claire as she carefully arranged the papers on the desk. Her movements were calm, almost deliberate, but to the trained eye they revealed control, calculation, and awareness far beyond that of a simple observer. Parker lingered near the door, uncertain whether to intervene or to let the detective work in his own way. Whimsy's voice, calm but precise, broke the silence. "Miss Claire, it has become evident that the events surrounding the widow's death, the assaults, and the vanished evidence were not solely the work of the man who confessed. His actions were visible, yes, but they were guided, manipulated, and shaped by another hand. Yours, perhaps, knowingly or unknowingly, has influenced the entire course of this investigation." Claire's eyes flickered, the slightest tension betraying her composure. "My lord, I only wish to protect what was rightfully theirs. The ledger, the letters, I feared the truth would destroy innocent reputations if misused." Whimsy inclined his head slowly. "And in protecting that, you acted decisively, employing subtle manipulations, nudging the confessed intruder, influencing witnesses, and arranging circumstances so that your goals were met. Yet the method you chose, precise, calculated, almost invisible, left traces. Small, overlooked details, fragments of handwriting, habitual gestures, and timing of movements all pointed toward orchestration beyond mere coincidence. In essence, you designed the chaos, even if your aim was ostensibly noble." Claire's hands trembled slightly. "I never intended harm. I only sought to ensure the past could not harm the living." "And therein lies the crux," Whimsy replied, voice steady, eyes sharp. "Intent alone does not excuse action. By guiding another to commit violent or destructive acts, by concealing evidence, by influencing outcomes, you became a participant in the chain of consequences. The difference between yourself and the man now detained lies in visibility. He acted openly. You acted from shadows. But shadows, however dark, still leave shapes, and shapes can be read." Briggs, standing quietly by the fireplace, shifted uncomfortably. "My lord, I never realized." "Precisely, Mrs. Briggs," Whimsy interjected gently. "You were manipulated, as were others, by the subtle guidance of a mind attuned to psychology and routine. Your fear and compliance were tools, not choices." The genius of Miss Claire's approach was that it left no overt trace of orchestration. But the faintest irregularities betray the hand, if one knows where to look. Claire's lips parted, almost in protest, but Whimsy continued, his voice measured. Observe the ledger once more. The marginal notes, the folds, the smudges of ink, they were arranged so that the intruder would follow certain actions, reveal certain truths, and yet be trapped within a controlled frame. Every movement, every hesitation, every response from witnesses was subtly guided. That is why he believed himself in control. That is why he was so confident in his calculated assaults and threats. And yet, all of it was anticipated. And ultimately, all of it has led here. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Even Parker felt the weight of the revelation. The intricate layering of control, manipulation, and influence that had sustained the entire drama. Whimsy's eyes glimmered with satisfaction, not cruelty, as he outlined the final connections. The notebook fragments under the desk, the ink smudges, the peculiar placement of the umbrella, the subtle deviations in Briggs' habitual motions, all were signs. Clues overlooked because observers expected chaos rather than design. And now, with all these pieces considered, the truth is revealed. The mastermind has been identified, not merely by confession, but by the invisible threads linking all actions. Claire exhaled, a mixture of relief and fear. And what now, my lord? Justice. Whimsy's gaze softened, though his expression remained thoughtful. Justice, in the legal sense, has already reached the confessed intruder. But true accountability, the reckoning for subtle orchestration, is a more complex matter. One can act from shadow and intellect, and yet escape immediate detection. Such is the challenge of the human mind when it conceals itself beneath careful reasoning. The law punishes the visible acts, the intellect can evade it, though never entirely the scrutiny of one trained to read patterns and motives. Claire's hands shook as she placed the final documents into a secure drawer. "Then I am free." "For now," Whimsy replied, "because the law can only punish the deeds that are overt. But remember, the faintest detail, the smallest irregularity, has revealed your hand to those who watch closely. Wisdom and morality remain the guardians of consequence, even when legal structures cannot intervene." Briggs, still uneasy, muttered, "It feels incomplete." "Something lingers." Whimsy nodded gravely. "Indeed. There is always a residue of uncertainty when human minds are involved. Some threads remain, some intentions hidden, some consequences unobserved. The confessed intruder faces the law, the mastermind's subtle manipulations escape formal judgment, leaving us with the knowledge that justice has been served in part, yet not entirely." He rose, smoothing his coat and glancing once more around the study. "Notice how each clue, each deviation, each faint inconsistency contributed to the final understanding. The ink smudge under the drawer, the folded scrap of paper, the habitual gestures, and the orchestrated timing. They all pointed toward orchestration, revealing a mind several steps ahead of ordinary perception. That is why observation, patience, and comprehension of human psychology are essential. One may conceal actions, but one cannot conceal patterns forever." Parker exhaled, absorbing the layered revelations. "So the case is closed yet unresolved." Whimsy smiled faintly. "Precisely. The visible threat has been neutralized. The confessed intruder will answer to law. The subtle manipulations have been revealed, and yet, the intelligence behind them, the guiding hand, has evaded capture. Justice has been delivered in part, but the human intellect remains a wild variable, unpredictable, enduring, and occasionally elusive." Claire looked down at the ledger, the papers, the reconstructed letters. "Then perhaps I will carry the knowledge, but act differently in future. The truth is revealed, but consequences remain." Whimsy inclined his head. "That is wisdom. Understanding one's own influence, the capacity to shape events, and the responsibility that accompanies subtle power. That is a kind of justice in itself. The rain outside had ceased, leaving the streets glistening under the morning light. The world seemed calm, deceptively so, as though nothing extraordinary had transpired. Yet within the Harwood house, the residue of human ambition, obsession, and intellect lingered, a quiet testament to the intricate web that had been unraveled. Wimsey lit his pipe once more and regarded the study, the ledger, the faint smudges, and the assembled witnesses. Observe, Parker, the lessons in this case. Nothing is insignificant, no habit trivial, no gesture too small. The human mind leaves traces, however faint. The confessed intruder acted boldly and openly, yet the master manipulator worked invisibly, leaving a subtler trail. That is why a patient, discerning eye always remains a step ahead. As the authorities prepared to transport the confessed intruder, and the household began to return to a semblance of normality, Wimsey allowed himself a final reflection. The case was resolved in the visible sense. Yet the hidden manipulations left an unsettling residue, a reminder that human cunning is persistent, patterns endure, and justice, while served, can sometimes elude full completion. And so the mystery of the widow's last letter concluded. Justice partially delivered, truth revealed, and yet, in the quiet corners of the human mind, a lingering shadow remained, an unfinished thread that only the observant could ever hope to follow. The streets outside were wet and gleaming, reflecting the early morning light in puddles that rippled with each gust of wind. Wimsey walked slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, the rhythm of his steps deliberate and contemplative. Parker kept pace beside him, observing his master's quiet intensity. The city had returned to its ordinary hum, the storm passing, leaving only the faint scent of damp brick and coal smoke. Yet for Wimsey, the case was not entirely closed. A residue of questions remained, subtle and insistent, like shadows in the periphery of vision. "The intruder is in custody," Parker said, glancing down at the folded ledger under Wimsey's arm. "The confessions taken, the evidence restored. It seems all loose ends have been tied." Wimsey nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "On the contrary, Parker. The visible ends are tied, yes. But consider the subtler threads, the hidden manipulations, the delicate orchestration of the events by the person we have only inferred. Justice has been served in part, yet the true influence remains elusive. There is always a lingering question when a mind operates in shadows." They passed through a narrow side street, the glow from gas lamps casting long reflections on the cobblestones. Wimsey's eyes drifted over the ordinary details. The misplaced shutter on one window, a stray note caught in the iron railings, the faint traces of mud on a doorstep. All mundane, all seemingly insignificant. Yet his mind catalogued them meticulously, aware that even minor irregularities can sometimes point to the extraordinary. The ledger, the letters, even the confessions, he continued, voice low, all provide answers, yet the true question is whether the orchestration we inferred is truly dormant, or whether it continues beyond our immediate observation. Human cunning is seldom content with a single expression. It evolves, it adapts, it waits for opportunity. Parker frowned, sensing the familiar tension. "Are you suggesting the mastermind might still be influencing events?" "Not in overt terms," Wimsey replied. "But influence does not always announce itself with threats or violence. It is subtle, a misdirected glance, a whispered suggestion, the faintest nudge that sets others in motion. I observed the signs in the conduct of Miss Clare, the intruder's responses, even in the hesitation of Mrs. Briggs, and though the immediate danger has passed, the mind behind these subtleties is one that does not relinquish control easily." As they rounded a corner, a young messenger appeared, breathless, carrying a small envelope marked with neat, unfamiliar handwriting. Whimsy accepted it without breaking stride, slicing the seal with practiced fingers. Parker observed over his shoulder as the note inside was unfolded. It was brief, cryptic. The ledger shows the past, but some truths are hidden still. Watch the ink, note the folds, follow the rhythm. Whimsy's eyes glimmered. A smile, faint and knowing, curved his lips. See, Parker. Even now, a message subtle, almost invisible, hints at continuations. The game is not truly over. A lingering thread has been left deliberately, and only a careful observer can discern its meaning. Parker's brows knitted. Do you intend to follow it? Whimsy exhaled a thin curl of smoke. Considering. I will, in due time. But the purpose of this walk is reflection, cataloguing the psychological footprint already left behind. Each event, each minor discrepancy, contributes to a larger understanding of human behavior, and that understanding is never complete. The lessons of the widow's last letter are profound, but they do not encompass the entirety of the intelligence at work. The final act may reveal itself gradually, in patterns we have yet to anticipate. They moved toward the bridge overlooking the Thames, the river below dark and swirling from the storm's runoff. The city's pulse continued. Boats moving silently in the water. Factory chimneys exhaling faint smoke, the occasional shout of a street vendor echoing across the mist. It was ordinary and yet pregnant with possibility. Every passerby could conceal intention, every shadow might mask significance. Whimsy paused, resting a hand lightly on the rail. He regarded the river. The reflection of the city fragmented in the ripples. Parker, what we have witnessed is a reminder: human motives are rarely singular, and actions are rarely isolated. Even when one mind is exposed, another may persist unseen, guiding events with subtlety, testing observers, shaping outcomes without leaving immediate trace. And so, even resolved cases leave behind a residue, a question, a pattern, an invitation to vigilance. Parker glanced at him, sensing the depth of his contemplation. It is unsettling, my lord, to think that even after justice is served, the unseen hand may remain at work. Unsettling, Whimsy agreed. Yet it is also the very essence of deduction. Observation and patience reveal much, but not everything. Some mysteries linger precisely because human ingenuity defies complete closure. It is the nature of our work, and it is the nature of the world. As they turned to leave the bridge, the faint sound of a carriage echoed from a distant street, and Whimsy's eyes flicked toward the movement of shadows near an alleyway. It was nothing overt, nothing immediate. Yet the faint irregularity, the way a figure lingered too long before passing, the subtle weight of its posture, suggested observation, calculation, awareness. Whimsy smiled faintly, pocketing the cryptic note. See, Parker, even as one case concludes, the world presents new enigmas. Clues, misdirections, patterns waiting to be discerned. They are endless. The mystery of the widow's last letter may have reached its apparent conclusion, but the residue remains. And that, my dear Parker, is what keeps the pursuit of truth alive. They walked on, the streets slowly brightening with morning activity, footsteps echoing in the damp air thick with anticipation. The city carried on around them, ordinary and oblivious, yet in every corner, in every shadow. The subtle dance of observation and concealment continued. And Whimsy, thoughtful and composed, understood that the human mind would always leave traces, that patterns never vanish entirely, and that even the most carefully concealed mystery could never be fully extinguished. The ledger, the letters, the confessions, all were now in the open, yet the faintest trace of the unseen hand lingered, like a whisper across the pages. And as Whimsy and Parker disappeared into the bustling streets, the reader, like the detective, was left with a final, tantalizing sense. The case might be ostensibly closed, but the world of human cunning and subtle influence never truly ends. The mystery, in its deepest sense, was eternal.